Mhm.
John, should we start?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Before John takes over, we'll be sharing the discussion, as you all know. You can see that in the program. I will just briefly introduce the School of Materialist Research. So the School of Materialist Research, SMR, is an education and research, just a second, I hear an echo. Okay, the School of Materialist Research, SMR, is an education and research inter-university grassroots platform that offers integrated credit programs, seminars, special programs, such as this one, and research initiatives that address the materialisms running through contemporary science, philosophy, art, mathematics, design, architecture, and politics. SMR was founded by the Center for Philosophical Technologies at Arizona State University, the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities from Skopje, the Department of Architecture, Theory and Philosophy of Technics at the Technical University of Vienna, and the Critical Inquiry Lab at the Design Academy Eindhoven, the Netherlands, and serves as a global hub for education, research, and experimentation at the intersection of the humanities, social sciences, creative fields, and the STEM sciences. All the content, most of the content we offer is open to everybody, free of charge, of the nature this tonight's special program is. However, we also offer credit programs, which is merely a minor fraction of what we do. And that call for enrollments is open until the 11th. So that's all from me for now. I hand the floor over to John now.
Thank you very much, Katerina. Lovely to be here. It's the evening here in the Netherlands, so welcome everyone around the world, whatever time zone or land you are hailing from. Yes, here we are at the School of Materialist Research, and we're looking at the topic of the ideas of Francois Laruelle and his notion of non-philosophy, or non-standard philosophy, as it's sometimes called, and materialism, naturally enough, whatever that might mean. We've got 5 people participating in a roundtable, and that means it's fairly much an open, very loose, dynamic, I hope, conversation. I'm just going to open up with I'm chairing it, but that merely means that I'm going to do the introductions, tell you who else is participating, a little bit about them, and their background, what they've written on Laruelle, why they're interested in Laruelle. And then I'll have a little opening spiel. It's about 5 minutes. That's about it. About some ideas that might or might not arise in the discussion. So that we'll do that for an hour or so, I imagine, and we have enough of a slot. Then we'll open it up to questions from the other participants, both here on Zoom, but also through the live stream through, I think it's YouTube. And we'll get some selected questions from there and keep the ball rolling. So let me begin by introducing everybody. We've got Anthony Paul Smith, for instance, Associate Professor at the Department of Religion and Theology at La Salle University, and he has published widely on European philosophy, philosophy of religion, and the environmental humanities. Some of you may already know some of his works. Monographs Laruelle, A Stranger Thought, Francois Laruelle's Principles of Non-Philosophy, A Critical Introduction and Guide, and A Non-Philosophical Theory of Nature, Ecologies of Thought. We've also have Jonathan Fardy here, who is Associate Professor of Art History and Chair of the Department of Art at Idaho State University. His books include Laruelle and Art, The Aesthetics of Non-Philosophy, The Real is Radical. Sorry, that's, yes, The Real is Radical, isn't it? Marked after Laruelle. And forthcoming January, I've got Ideology and Interpellation, Anti-Humanism to Non-Philosophy. I believe he's going to talk a little bit more on the kind of art and aesthetic side of his approach to Laruelle. Thirdly, we have Rocco Gangle here, also from the United States, like Jonathan, Associate Professor of Humanities and Philosophy at Endicott College, USA. His work is on contemporary French thought, Laruelle, Spinoza, and Peirce as well, and diagrammatic logic, and has appeared in many journals such as Philosophy Today, Substance, Political Theology, and in other journals and edited collections. Amongst his publications are the books Iconicity and Abduction, and the very well received Diagrammatic Immanence. Not that the others weren't very well received, it's just that that was particularly well received. Fourthly, we have Katerina Kolozova, who will be a stranger to few here, I imagine. We just heard her. Senior researcher, full professor at the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities, pardon my pronunciation, Skopje, and visiting faculty of Arizona State University Center for Philosophical Technologies. She's a member of the board of directors of the New Center for Research and Practice, Seattle, and co-director of the School of Materials Research, hence she is here. But she's also here, of course, in the other capacity as a Laruelle specialist. And amongst her other works she's the author of Capitalism's Holocaust of Animals, a non-Marxist critique of capital, philosophy, and patriarchy, The Cut of the Real, Subjectivity and Post-Structuralist Philosophy, and Toward a Radical Metaphysics of Socialism, Marx and Laruelle. And finally, I should introduce myself. I am honorary professor at Kingston University, London, and I'm currently based in the Netherlands as an associate researcher at Radboud University in Nijmegen. And I've published a number of books on Laruelle, Bergson, Gilles Deleuze, film philosophy, and metaphysics, and have edited a number of collections in that area. I've been interested in Laruelle since 2000, really, I think. And I've come to him in a long, winding trajectory through metaphysics, through film, through metaphilosophy, and so on. So let me just say a few words then about the theme we're looking at here tonight. Oh, when I say tonight, or today, or this morning, depending where you are. So materialism and non-philosophy, in particular that notion of non-philosophy, understood initially through the work of Francois Laruelle. So the question is matter, materiality, the material, and indeed materialism. And all of these terms, of course, have different meanings. In Katerina's introduction to the School of Materialist Research, that definition, and it's kind of on its own webpage, describes itself as an entity addressing, quote, the materialisms plural, running through contemporary science, philosophy, art, mathematics, design, architecture, and politics. So I think that's an interesting gambit already, to think about this plural material isms, breaking the term up in that way. You can understand the term, therefore, theoretically through material, or positionally through the notion of an ism, or indeed as both. So what do we mean by a material ism as such, as a position in philosophy? So I think this is worth rehearsing, partly because, of course, Laruelle is well known as a philosopher of philosophy. Without, of course, he does not like the word metaphilosophy. It's not a representation of philosophy. It is a practice of non-standardizing philosophy, as he puts it. And that's partly why we're here, this question of isms and the philosophy of an ism, a material ism. And how does that lay with Laruelle's own philosophy or non-philosophy or non-standard philosophy and its own embrace of the material? It is avowedly about matter and the material, namely the material of philosophy. Now, Laruelle, if you don't know this already, born 1937, alive and kicking, still with us, I'm glad to say, as Professor Emeritus in Philosophy at the University of Nanterre, Paris, and indeed inventor of this notion of non-philosophy or non-standard philosophy, having authored almost 30 books by now on this project, which he sees in my words, and it can be very well seen in very different ways by others, as a way to envision philosophy as matter, as material. This is the first time I ever heard anything about LARUELLE. Like, I'd been studying continental philosophy for 15 years by the time I met. It was at a strange old university reception, and I bumped into a PhD student called Ray Brazier, who you may well know. And we got chatting, as about you do when you have nobody else to talk to and you're a bit sad and lonely. And I asked him, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm working on LARUELLE. And never heard of him. And indeed, of course, Ray then wrote a famous essay about the greatest French philosopher you've never heard of, as a way to look at LARUELLE. And I said, well, what's his thing? What's his shtick? And indeed, he says, well, it is a kind of philosophical materialism, but it's the materialism of philosophy itself. It's philosophy as matter. And this really struck me. This kind of hit home, because it was, I'm not saying it was a road to Damascus or some epiphany, but it was something I was really interested in, the idea of thought itself as raw material in a non-reductive fashion, not by thinking of thought through the brain. You can read Paul Churchland or Patricia Churchland. You could have been doing that all through the 80s and happy. That would be a reductive neuroscientific approach. What is thought? But taking thought content and treating it as matter. And indeed, of course, in the origins of LARUELLE, amongst many other sources, Nietzsche, Ravesson, perhaps as well, there is Derrida and Deleuze. And it was striking this idea that there is a kind of Derridean aspect. Derrida, of course, who also talks about the materiality of language, the materiality of philosophy through the materiality of language, the form. But then with LARUELLE, as Ray was explaining it to me, or as I at least was understanding it, it is not a textual in that way. It's not linguistic. It is, somebody will of course say, oh, Derrida is not linguistic either, but never mind. It is more Deleuzian. It is machinic. It is inflating language in a certain way, such that there is no reduction of philosophical thought. It is materialized, used as raw material, but it is not critiqued. It is not a question of positioning itself as a new, greater philosophy, the next big thing, that this would be, the great new Derrida, the new Deleuze. It was never meant to be that. It's not a position that argues with or critiques other philosophies, but rather re-envisions them, looks at them with a different logic as material. Anyway, that's how I saw. To quote LARUELLE himself, he said, there is a body of philosophy, a philosophical materiality, a conceptual and lived material, and you can treat philosophy as a part of physical nature without reduction, I believe. Now, and that's certainly the way I've kind of espoused LARUELLE in my own writings of him, but I'm very interested in hearing other approaches. But given that there's that as a kind of one way of looking at LARUELLE, he mentions physical nature, and that leads to the question, well, what do we mean by, for instance, materialism, which is why we are here in part? Do we mean physicalism, where the science of physics tells us what matter is at any one point, so the materialism becomes physicalist? Maybe. Certainly in his latest works from what's called phase 5 or wave 5 non-standard philosophy, there is an embrace of quantum mechanics like never before. That would seem to be a kind of physicalist approach. It's not my favorite version of LARUELLE, I have to admit, but it is there. And what about naturalism? He mentions that philosophy is a part of physical nature. Now, naturalism understood almost, it seems, in the second phase of his work, the non-philosophy work of the early 80s, there is a kind of naturalism there, even perhaps a scientism, where science is understood as now in the vanguard, in the best way of understanding the real and reality. Speaking of which, of course, there is, I should mention realism as another part synonym for, or equivocation if you prefer, for materialism or physicalism or naturalism, realism. What does the real here mean? It's not just a simple adoption even from Lacan's notion of the real. French philosophers going back to Bergson and earlier have talked about the real. And there's a Marxist element in as much as well, there's this notion of determination in the last instance, which is a non-reductive realism. The real determines everything, but not in any particular way. It doesn't have to be economics. It doesn't have to be modes of production. It's not that kind of realist materialism. So there's a lot going on. But on top of that, and I think we're going to talk about this, and I'm going to shut up in about 2 minutes, you'll be glad to hear. And on top of that, we have, of course, the contemporary scene, the contemporary currency of materialism in European thought, broadly speaking, philosophy in particular, but elsewhere. From biology to mathematics, from the notion of plasticity in neuroscience to the algorithms of computer science, in a way that 30 years ago, when I was a young lad, and everyone was reading a bit of Blanchot and Nancy and a bit of what have you, Derrida, the algorithms and modal logic, that was for the analytic philosophers, the scientific approach, as we would dismiss it. But now, of course, you can talk about epigenesis in Catherine Malabou's latest work, and indeed quantum entanglement in Karen Barad's philosophy of physics, or indeed vibrant matter in Jane Bennett's neo-vitalism, just to mention three. But I think we're going to hear perhaps more recent research in the area of not just new materialism, but speculative realism from Rocco, I think is going to say maybe one or two things there. So certainly matter is important now to contemporary thought. Matter matters, as the pun goes, as opposed to the immaterial being immaterial, to put the pun in the other direction. I myself, I'm interested in that dyad of matter and spirit, if you want to call it an opposite, materialism and spiritualism, if you want to put positions, philosophical positions on them, and understanding them through a Bergsonian prism as tendencies, as orientations rather than as substances, as a kind of processual way of looking at these things. But certainly I think we're in an interesting moment in European stroke continental thinking, both within philosophy, strictly speaking, and more broadly in the notion of thought or theory, as it's called, where thinking has, in a sense, come back down to earth, become earthly, become material, in that Nietzschean notion. Immanence as being a big key word, of course, for Laruelle, notion of radical immanence, but it's also there in Badiou, as it is in Deleuze, of course, and many other philosophers, understood to a degree as broaching on questions of science, of mathematics, of physics, of nature, of the earth, of matter, the body as well. But again, all of these terms are contested. David Papineau, an analytic philosopher, once famously said, or famously within our own small world, that everybody wants to be a naturalist these days. But what does that really mean? What do we mean by nature? And indeed, nature, matter, physics, these are contested terms, polysemic terms. And given the sophistication of Laruelle's own approach to philosophy and its history, and his steady avoidance of the dialectical traps, going from one ism to another, from materialism to spiritualism, for just one example, we might well ask then about the significance of these contemporary materialisms that I mentioned above for his own thinking. So that's me and a little spiel there. And I'm just now going to, if it's okay with everyone, and that was a rhetorical question because you have no choice. I'm going to go around everyone and see from the other participants, opening views, thoughts, suggestions, intuitions, call them what you will, fundamental insights, what have you. And I'm going to start, because I know Anthony Paul Smith in the USA has to leave at some point, but he's got a couple of things to say, I hope.
I'll try. Yeah, I apologize. I'm in the middle of my teaching today, so I'll have to jump off the call at 1:30 my time. That's East Coast time to teach. Yeah, I guess what I would add to that, and I apologize as well. I hope you can hear me over the many fans that are trying to keep me cool at the moment here. So I got interested in LARUELLE in part for similar reasons to John. It was actually John's, I've forgotten the name of that book now. On Continuum. Yes, Post-Continental Philosophy. Yeah, thank you. Reading
I sleep
that
with
text,
it under my pillow.
I mean, but I was reading that text in an MA class where I was specifically really interested in the question of immanence. I was doing a MA and PhD in philosophical theology and environmental philosophy. I'm trying to think about kind of shared problems in philosophy of religion and environmental philosophy. And I was really obsessed with this question of immanence. What I saw in John's presentation of LARUELLE was that LARUELLE offered a kind of different vision of immanence that specifically was interesting to me because of how it offered a new kind of methodology for thinking. So for me, I was working in the UK at the time when like this speculative realism thing was blowing up, and for whatever reason, as a young man, I was angry and easily annoyed. As an old man, I'm still angry and easily annoyed, but I just don't have as much energy or perhaps hope that the anger or annoyance will go anywhere. But I remember being kind of like, it would always just rub me wrong, the stuff coming out of Brassier's work, out of Mayhew's work. But that was kind of the debate raging around at the time when I was encountering this stuff. But for me, the real out that LARUELLE offered was an out to a very staid environmental philosophy. So the kind of revisioning of what the concept of nature, the reality of nature might mean once you got rid of a certain kind of Anglo-American naturalism that's very common in environmental philosophy. That's I find to be a particularly not very deep naturalism, not a very conceptually interesting form of naturalism. I think there's other things that call themselves naturalisms that I wouldn't include in that camp, of course. But what I saw in LARUELLE was this idea of treating thought in a particular way that, as John said, was kind of non-reductively naturalist. That offered me a way to reconceive of some things that were happening in environmental philosophy. I lay this out. This is in my first book, which is now over 10 years old, which is, I don't have children, so I can only feel my age by looking at the age of my books. So it came out now 10 years ago, and in there, I kind of lay this out more clearly, but just as a general approach, what I saw in certain kinds of environmental philosophy was always this approach to nature and to ecology, meaning the science of ecology, where philosophy thought it was coming into the room and really doing something. Like it would show up and be like, okay, this is what you actually mean, this is this, and the ethical problems that are present or are made present to us in a kind of prophetic way by ecology. We can take those ethical problems and put them through our kind of our grinder, and we'll get like the utilitarian answer, we'll get the naturalist answer, we'll get whatever kind of ready-made answer might be once you have that philosophical system in place. And LARUELLE's method allowed me to say, well, what happens if instead we start to treat these different disciplines on a kind of equal footing in some sense, in a democratic way, or later on a kind of communistic way, LARUELLE might say. And instead of treating nature like something that philosophy is subject to, and yet also the master of, like I found in some kind of naturalisms, what if instead we treated nature as an ecological thing? as something that worked ecologically in the same way that elements of any ecosystem do. And hopefully, I think that helped clarify some things in my thinking on the environment, on questions of ethics, and so forth. But ultimately, that's what he offered me, was a way out of what felt to me like a chokehold for philosophy. This kind of he has this essay. It actually comes from the non-Marxism book, but an essay that Brassier translated early on, the decline of materialism in the name of matter. This was a kind of decline of naturalism in the name of nature, allowing us to kind of see a much more vertiginous kind of thinking of nature, something that makes the immensity of the ethical challenge, the human challenge, far more, I think, clear than what I was getting out of the standard kind of environmental philosophy at the time. So there's some other things I could say about LARUELLE and religion, LARUELLE and method, but in terms of the theme of this kind of discussion, for me, it was always this kind of question of the relationship, getting out of a kind of abusive relationship with naturalism that non-philosophy sort of offered.
Can I ask, Anthony, because I know you've got to, before I go over to Jonathan, in terms of the fact that you have put LARUELLE in play in a number of different areas, environmental studies and theology studies and so on, as a quite unique position, unique voice, that's quite, in a sense, hard to fathom at first, I think, for people, newcomers. But I've given talks at animal studies groups, for instance, and initially, well, this happened at least once anyway. They haven't a clue what I'm talking about, but something does eventually click with a few people, and they say, "Oh, I get it now. That's in," etc. and so on. But I don't know if anything ever continued in that vein. A LARUELLian subset of animal studies work within the Anglosphere. I'm talking about. Obviously, Katerina's done work like that, and as have you and myself. Likewise, in film studies, there's a certain level of interest in LARUELLE. But it's anyway. My point, Anthony, is have you been able to see that LARUELLian, shall we call it, intervention, return, go places? Did it echo with anybody or resonate, or what?
A fair question. I think that in what we call the environmental humanities, I think, okay, I'll channel younger Anthony a little bit. I'll just be very honest. I think what's happened in environmental humanities is it just talks to itself kind of over and over again, and it claps itself on the back for writing another kind of study of literature in relationship to the environment, and picking up the new hot theorist, which there's fewer and fewer hot theorists that we can pick up on in the Anglosphere, because I think one thing we don't realize about what's happening in Europe is they've also been slowly destroying the possibilities for invention and creativity in their academic system as well. Like the generation of '68 was a kind of moment, and so I don't think there's been a lot of picking up of specifically LARUELLE, which, take or leave that. Like I agree with LARUELLE that in some sense he's like, LARUELLE does not exist. It's the kind of line that he gave you and I in an interview we did with him. But that impulse to take very seriously the real of this or that, I think academia actively works against it. It's a machine of harassment. So I don't see that as much in the environmental humanities. What I do see is activists, though, like in activist circles, there is this real attempt to try and find a way to, there's a temptation to woo-ness, to like the mystical that can be unhelpful. There's also a temptation to a kind of scientism, which is another kind of mysticism as well. But there's a real sense of taking seriously the human demand to embody to be, to think nature in this way. So I guess, I don't think anyone's getting tenure off of this, but I think what LARUELLE's ideas are tapped into is something that is closer to what we see out a little bit outside of those kind of academic trends anyway. Though he does it in this highly specialized, highly abstract language. I think you can see elements of that in other parts of human life, but less so in our fields, so to speak. But also that could just be someone who's bitter because I don't go to Salsa anymore, which is a big conference in this kind of area or whatever. But that would be my take, so to speak.
Okay, good. Yeah, we met at Salsa in 2015. That was our last time. Okay, Jonathan, would you like to say something on your perspective on materialism, LARUELLE, and so on?
Sure. Thanks, John. And thank you for the invite. Really a pleasure to be here. And thanks for everyone who showed up at this. Yeah, I hope this isn't self-indulgent, but it does. I thought I would talk a little bit about, as John did in his own case, and Anthony did in his, about how I came to start reading texts by LARUELLE. Actually, Anthony came to my alma mater, the Center for Theory, when I was still a PhD student, and gave a talk on LARUELLE. And that was my first real, I'd heard other students talking about it, about his work, but that was my first real sort of introduction to it. And I was, very confused, befuddled, and very frustrated, actually. Mostly actually because I remember very distinctly the statement or the claim being that LARUELLE's work doesn't constitute, at least in LARUELLE's view, a meta-philosophy. And that really struck me as, I couldn't quite square that claim. It just seemed to be all about philosophy. So there was a sort of frustration moment. And I did take a look at, because of my interest in art, and at the time specifically, I was working on photography, the history of 19th century photography in particular. And so I took a look at the book on non-photography, and the frustration was just sort of increased. I couldn't get to the bottom of it, but it was sort of a book that I kept returning to, partly because I was trying to understand what the interest was, or why maybe I was missing something or something like that. But I think that for me, the moment that it became really interesting was actually starting teaching students, strangely, and this is something I only kind of see now in retrospect, but first in Canada and then Hong Kong and now in the US, I have basically taught art history to mostly to art students, be they undergraduate art students or graduate students working in the visual arts broadly. And what I noticed was that I was hired in these different areas often to teach modern and contemporary art, but also teach something like art theory. And that was usually something we would teach in an upper division course or in a graduate course. And what I found was that, and this is a bit, I think Anthony put it really well, like you noted something like, philosophy comes into the room and thinks it does something. And I think that's a good way of describing what I felt was often happening in discussions of art theory with art students. It felt like I was sort of bringing in these texts and saying, here, read these things. But I'm talking to people who do a thinking in material terms. They're making objects, events, they're engaged in material processes. And it did feel in a way that I think LARUELLE gave me a language or a framework to understand this sort of tension I felt, which was that somehow it seemed that philosophy, in that broad sense that LARUELLE uses the term, which would include, by the way, lots of aspects of art history, philosophies of periodization and taxonomy and so forth, seemed to arrive on the scene to kind of categorize, to judge. And it struck me that LARUELLE gave me a kind of, again, a language or a framework to begin to unpack that about, he says in the preface of the photo fiction book, and I paraphrase, but something like, aesthetics is the claimed domination of art, since Hegel. And that sense of the claimed domination, at least that's what's translated, I thought was really helpful. That does seem to be often the case, is that art theory will step in and it claims to kind of know or decide or categorize. So one thing it's helped me to kind of think through is that there is, I think, and it's still, I think, somewhat prevalent today in the teaching of the arts, is a kind of division of labor, or maybe in the art world in general, division of labor between sort of the making of art and the thinking or the theorizing or the historicizing of art, and that these worlds are between the studio and the classroom. And that for me at least, LARUELLE's work gave me a way of rethinking or reframing that tension that I saw. The other point of entry into this actually comes from an essay that had been in the back of my mind for a long time before I started reading LARUELLE, which was an essay by the art historian W.J.T. Mitchell. And it's an essay called Addressing Media. And he lays out in Addressing Media a series of theses, a series of propositions about trying to rethink how we might approach something like media theory or media studies. And one of the propositions that I really thought was interesting, that is sort of left undeveloped, is just a kind of thesis statement, is that, I'm paraphrasing, but that theory is a medium. And on that score, Mitchell says, it's strange, or perhaps in some extent impossible, to think of a theory of media, because he says theory itself is a medium. It lives in a kind of environ of texts, of conferences, roundtables like this. And that idea, I didn't know what to do with at the time, but I thought it was interesting to think about theorizing as a kind of practice in a medium. And I think that what LARUELLE does, for me at least, is to kind of really more rigorously open up and think through the consequences of something that John already noted, which was central to LARUELLE's thinking, is this materialism of philosophical writing, of philosophical statement making. And that, for me, at least in my own work teaching art students, has, if only in a kind of, has reframed my intentions, at least in terms of thinking, well, if we think about the relationship between art theory and, say, practices like painting or performance art or what have you, as simply being different practices in different kinds of media, I think that's, for me, a really rich way of redescribing and rethinking that relationship, and beginning to perhaps break down, or, like Anthony put it really well, I think, like you said, move outside of, find an exit out of what I thought was a kind of deadlock between this division of labor, where artists get to make and the theorist gets to think. And that notion of thinking about these are not simply, but importantly, different kinds of medial practices. But I think that's where I began to find LARUELLE really interesting, useful, is to think about what it means to take philosophy and philosophical work as a material practice. And that, I think, does open up, at least in my view, what I tried to at least think through in LARUELLE and Art, at least, was to think about what might the consequences be when we begin to think about, say, the practice of aesthetics or the philosophy of art as, in fact, not this claimed domination of art by philosophy in the standard orientation, but as a para practice, as a parallel practice to other forms of thinking in and making with materials. And I think that, at least for me, has been one of the things I find most interesting about his work still today. And I liked what John said, and I would agree. I have seen lots of different ways in which I can, one of the things I guess I admire or find compelling about a thinker is when a thinker kind of enables me, or maybe even forces me, to read things differently, maybe to go back to other philosophers or other theorists or what have you, and to see other things in them or read them in different ways. And John had mentioned, about mentioned Derrida, and I think that John put it well when he said, I do see connections, between the two, in the sense that Derrida was very concerned with the materiality of language, even things like dealing with placement on a page and some of his more experimental texts, where he really seems to be concerned with the materiality of theoretical construction. But that I think I would agree that while I think a figure like Derrida kind of explores and exploits those issues, interestingly, he doesn't do what I think LARUELLE does, which is to explore and exploit that, but then to use that also as a lever to turn back and and level a critique about standard philosophy. And finally, I guess I would say that I only started recently, just last semester, actually. I spent just one day on LARUELLE, and we just read the preface to the photo fiction book. And what was really interesting to me about that experiment was I had in past presented aspects of his work to photo historians, photo theorists, art historians, and so forth. And most of the time, there's a lot of concern in the room. But I guess but when I was talking with art students, at least in that moment, the group that I had with me, they were really interested in it. They saw this as resonant to some extent with their own experience in material making. I'll stop there and open it up.
Super. Thank you, Jonathan. And I'm sure we'll come back to these ideas, but yeah, just to move along. Rocco, how about your own approach to LARUELLE?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, yeah, thanks for the invite, and it's great to be here with all of you and to see at least some of the names of some familiar faces there in the gallery. I first came across LARUELLE in a bookstore in Paris, right near the Sorbonne. It was Future Christ. It's this wonderful kind of red cover, and I pulled it out and I read just one sentence. And I immediately knew that this was something I was very interested in. And that might seem anecdotal, and it is anecdotal, but I think it's also essential to one important aspect of LARUELLE's thought, which is expressed maybe most clearly in the earliest phase of his thought, what he calls philosophy 1, which is this sort of pre-non-philosophy phase, which is concerned very much with the relationship between Nietzsche and Heidegger, and also trying to work out a certain kind of Deleuzian reading of Derrida, and to identify that with a certain Derridian reading of Deleuze. So there's a quartet of books that work through this set of themes around Nietzsche, Heidegger, Deleuze, and Derrida. And in one of those books, the Decline of Writing, Déclin de l'écriture, LARUELLE develops a very fascinating theory of the aphorism and a concept of aphoristic writing and the aphoristic body. And he's drawing particularly from Nietzsche. But the upshot of his idea of the aphorism is that the aphorism is something more than an impulse, more than an affect, but a kind of hyperpulsional becoming that evacuates the content from the aphorism so as to illuminate something like the pure pulsional nature of an affect. And so this is, according to LARUELLE, before the development of non-philosophy and the specific sort of discovery of the one that he identifies with the new method of non-philosophy. But it's already, I think, very close in spirit to the motivation for non-philosophy, which is to, as Anthony was pointing out, to think a rigorous immanence. And if we take, at a first approach, any notion of what LARUELLE will call phenomenological distance, so built into any form of ordinary experience, there is something like a space that opens up between the experience and the experienced, right? And this seems to be the condition of possibility for experience, something like a kind of distancing or spacing. It seems natural to try to overcome that distance, right? That immanence would be the overcoming of that space or that gap. And I think that would move more in the direction of Bergson or Deleuze, that real immanence is the kind of collapse or overcoming of transcendence. But already with this theory of the aphorism, LARUELLE is saying we don't overcome the cliched reading of the aphorism or the reactive misinterpretation of the aphorism by just voiding its meaning, but rather the real overcoming of the cliche is to leave the cliche in place. The real overcoming of phenomenological distance is to leave phenomenological distance in place and actually move inside the immanence of that gap, of that space. Right? And in that sense, the notion of immanence that ultimately holds sway in non-philosophy is an immanence that cannot be distinguished from transcendence, or at least cannot be opposed to transcendence, because the very opposition of immanence and transcendence is understood as falling under transcendence, being structured through transcendence, that namely through opposition. So it is not opposition to opposition that constitutes true immanence, but actually a kind of radical indifference to the difference between opposition and non-opposition, or the difference between immanence and transcendence. And that mode of reading, right, that in Decline of Writing, LARUELLE really tries to say, what happens if we would generalize this aphoristic body, or this way of reading according to the aphorism, so that it would apply to all of the syntactical elements of a text. It would apply to all the partial objects that might be machinically organizing the signifieds of a text. This gives us an approach to textuality and the signifier that doesn't void or try to through some kind of turn to the affect or turn to the machinic, simply void out those aspects of the text, but to allow something that is prior to textuality in a different way than textuality itself would understand priority, right? And that problem, which is at the very core of LARUELLE's entire thought, which is how to think this immanence that is not the immanence against transcendence, or the priority or the one that is not opposed to the distinction of the one and the multiple, or the kind of priority that constitutes the transcendence of the one. This singular problem, which is manifest in all these different modes throughout LARUELLE's work, I think gives us a good handle on the problem of materialism in LARUELLE. And I wanted to just indicate, I think, two places where LARUELLE's approach might be relevant in contemporary work in materialism. And both of these are drawn from thinkers who align themselves with speculative realism, but aren't maybe as well known, or aren't part of that kind of first generation, like Meillassoux, who are or Harman, who are kind of identified with the movement. The first is Deborah Goldgaber. She's the author of a very good book on Derrida called Speculative Grammatology. And Goldgaber very much works, I think, in a line that is coming out of Karen Barad, Catherine Malibu, who I think you'd mentioned both of those thinkers, John, and trying to read, especially the early Derrida, in light of some of those more recent materialist thinkers, and to try to make the case that the notion of writing, and especially arche writing in Derrida, is really much richer, more materialist, less restricted by a notion of textuality than most readers of Derrida traditionally have thought, even those who have been proponents of deconstruction, right? That there's really a much richer notion of matter as that which both supports inscription and metamorphosis and also resists inscription and metamorphosis so as to produce something like the trace. And I think this is a really good work on Derrida, but interestingly, Goldgaber never cites LARUELLE, which I don't think is necessarily an oversight. LARUELLE's work on Derrida just isn't very well known. And yet in my reading of Goldgaber, I'm consistently astonished that she's saying things that strike me as very, very interesting and important about Derrida, and yet really are already anticipated quite strongly in LARUELLE's work on Derrida in the late 1970s. That his notion of machinic materialism and his book on the decline of writing already give a kind of generalized grammatology that is much closer in spirit to what Goldgaber, I think, is doing. So here's a place where even LARUELLE's very earliest work might be relevant to work that today is, I think, right on the cutting edge of certain continental materialism. The other example is the Brazilian philosopher Ilan Bensusan, who has a very, very nice book and sort of position called indexicalism. And he tries to develop a sort of comprehensive metaphysics through the notion of the index, right? The sort of the immediate encounter, right? The immediate thisness or thatness of an indication that is not a representation. And it's a very kind of interesting cocktail of Emmanuel Levinas and Alfred North Whitehead. And I think this too is a very interesting way to think about materialism and metaphysics, to say that ultimately the real is constituted through indexicality and not through representation, not through transcendence. But one interesting kind of symptom of Bensusan's work is that on the one hand, he has this kind of radical finitude, right? That the metaphysics, by reducing to indexicality, becomes radically situated, right? Being just is this kind of nexus of indexical relations that are localized without being localized in a space, right? Because the indexical is the contact, right? Not the kind of contextualization of the locus. And yet, especially kind of going through Whitehead, Bensusan wants this to be a general metaphysics. So again, you have this kind of logic of generalization, right? A generalized grammatology, a generalized indexicality. And as soon as we use the standard models of generalization, we inevitably fall back into the traditional relationships between the singular and the universal, for example. And Bensusan is very aware of this, and he himself says, like, at the end of the day, what I'm generating is something like a paradoxical metaphysics, because I'm radically finitizing or localizing indexicality, and yet I want this to be a metaphysics. I want this to somehow be saying what is true of being as such, or any possible being. And this is where I think LARUELLE offers a kind of contribution, maybe even a solution to some of these contemporary issues, because it's exactly the methods of non-philosophy that enable that radical indexicality to not necessarily be in a paradoxical relationship to universality, right? The non-philosophy subtracts the axiom that would require a certain logic of the singular and the universal to be in play. And just as, say, with intuitionistic logic, you have, with respect to classical logic, something that seems much weaker because you have fewer theorems, right? You have less that you can say. From another point of view, intuitionistic logic is more powerful, more general, because it is consistent with a larger class of models, right? All the models of classical logic are consistent with intuitionistic axioms, right? But in addition, you have other models. And that's, I think, a really helpful way to think of the contribution that LARUELLE's thought can make, and especially in contemporary debates on materialism. We can think of materialism as what can we say about matter, in which case non-philosophy probably doesn't look like such an attractive option. Or we can say what practices and approaches to matter are compatible with different ways that matter can actually subsist, right? What are the models that are compatible with a certain approach to materialism? And in that regard, I think non-philosophy shows tremendous promise in terms of a kind of generalized materialism.
Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you, Rocco. I'm sure you've inspired many people to go ahead and run off and read Bensusan and Goldgaber, as well as your own work, and hopefully you'll put these ideas, the LARUELLEAN kind of stance on these ideas and how they can make go to work even more productively. So finally, last but not least, Katerina Kolozova, our host, and your thoughts on LARUELLE and materialism.
Well, we agree that we would maybe start by talking about how we came about speaking about LARUELLE and his relation to materialism, and why we think this link matters and where this link takes place, and why is it of any relevance to discuss LARUELLE's work, LARUELLEAN studies, as some put it, and materialism, or the possibility of materialist thought in relation to it. So we agreed that we would kind of kick off the discussion by introducing, what triggered this interest in each of us. So I will speak maybe about my trajectory and the starting point of this interest. I must say, actually, it's very interesting that since I started working on LARUELLE in my youth, when I discovered LARUELLE, which is interesting. I also discovered him on my own in a bookstore next to the Sorbonne, just like Rocco. And I thought that I was the only one who was reading this, obscure philosopher. And he was important for me because I was in an interesting point in my life. At that time, I felt like, suffocated by so many things, including philosophy. And he was like offering a certain opening from philosophy, yet allowing for some play with philosophy, because I wasn't ready to abandon it fully altogether, although I was on the verge of it. But we said we would focus on the question of materialism. In spite of that, I had to go to the very beginning, because I wanted to explain that at the beginning, I did not notice the materialist potential, nor did I find any importance in seeking for such potential. In his thought. I wasn't interested in materialism. Let's put it that way. When I think back, I'm sure I was somehow spontaneously a materialist, but I didn't think it was worth the reflection. That the very, it was the postmodern era. The very question of either or idealism, materialism was outdated. Plus, I was born in Yugoslavia. I was raised in Yugoslavia, in a country ruled by a communist party. So it wasn't, like such Marx and materialism and Marxist materialism were not something that one would discover. It was, something you were taught at school about. So, it wasn't like so to me, it was like going back into something that I had supposedly surpassed. So that's why at the beginning, when I met Ray, again, everybody's mentioning Ray, Brazil. When I met him, which was in 2001, I think, and it was LARUELLE actually who introduced us. And his interest in LARUELLE's materialism was something that I kept filtering out. What mattered to me was, the issue of the question of decision, how he treats decision, the question of philosophical decision, the doing away with ontology, the critique of this static thought, all this stuff, the question of the real, the possibility of the real, but I never equated the real or realism with matter, of course. But the question of matter still somehow kept popping up when I would, discuss work on the question of the real and realism and what it entailed. Then I started asking myself, how does it relate to physicality, matter as physicality? So not physical, the mere physicality of things. But never really went deep into that exploration. So finally, this book, Introduction to Non-Marxism, his work on Marx, LARUELLE's works on Marx, brought me to the opened up the question of the problem of dialectical materialism in Marx for me. That led me to, there I followed LARUELLE's advice to read Marx directly in order to extract the identity of the last instance in that kind of science in becoming, because he does claim there that Marxism does have the potential as psychoanalysis to be non-philosophical, so some sort of a proper science of the human experience. And he proposes there, if you remember, that labor force would be the identity of the last instance from which one should derive the whole doctrine, or not doctrine, but the possibility of Marxian, not so Marxist, so excluding the tradition, Marxian thought. So this critique of dialectical materialism brought me to Marx's texts. I tried to read everything I could. I found out that Marx never speaks about dialectical materialism. We were taught so at our classes of Marxism in high school here, but there is no mention of this in his own text. It comes later on by the tradition of Marxism and the commentators later on. He does mention dialectics occasionally. He does discuss it, but not in a unity with materialism. So there is no such thing as simply the formulation, the expression is not there. Then that led me to the discovery that he was also cautious to use the term materialism as well, because it would end up, he was worried, Marx was worried, he was declaredly worried that in 3 of his texts, he declares this concern that if we're talking about isms, so very similar to LARUELLE, if we're talking about an ism, materialism, even matter, because these concepts are philosophical, we will end up doing idealism, actually philosophy, but philosophy would eventually end up being idealism. He's insisting on that in his critique of Hegel's philosophy in general. One would say, okay, this is one of the early texts, but we find this insistence in German ideology and later on. So I had to approach the question of matter and materialism in different terms. I started operating with the terms that were the preference, the preferred choice of Marx himself. So he used actually the physical and the real instead of matter and material when he meant material or materialist. But in order to avoid this philosophical definition of the concepts, he would resort to this two terms. So from there on, it will be a long story if I go into the entire genealogy of my interest and how I arrived at this notion of and the importance of the notion of mechanicity, matter and mechanicity. Matter understood as materialism postulated in mechanicist, not so much machinist, mechanicist terms. Can I put it that way in English? I hope so. I guess so. So I arrive at this realization by way of simply following what Marx does as practice, scientific practice in his own text. He simply he starts with discussing very concrete things, matters in a material fashion, and with this very simple descriptiveness, and the argument becomes more and more complex, more and more abstract, and then he establishes a certain pattern, derives the formula out of that. So I noticed that a similar procedure can be can be noticed in, can be seen, can be witnessed in the work, in the very progression of the argument in the Wittgenstein and Saussure. Saussure even speaks about the movement from the concrete to the abstract, only to return back to the concrete and the material, which is so similar to a phrase used by Marx. We all know this phrase. And now, to me, all of this was opened up because I was employing the procedure of dualysis, LARUELLEan dualysis, when discussing language and the subject of language, the human subject, in my consideration of the non-human, in fact. But I need to wrap up quickly. It's just very surprising. I just want to finish with this. It's very surprising to kind of walk this entire route and then just go back to some conclusions that your friend, in this case Ray, told you like ages ago, and you thought they were like unimportant. Some other things in LARUELLE are more important, and then you realize that materialism in LARUELLE is important, or the discussing the link between materialism, philosophy, materialism, and LARUELLE is of relevance. So,
thank you. Thanks.
Long, maybe.
So, quick question then to you, Katerina, that puts you maybe in a dialogue with Rocco and something that Rocco was saying, and excuse me if this is a false conflation.
Mhm.
But in terms of the topic at hand, materialism or materiality, given what Rocco was saying, that there is in LARUELLE a strange logic that allows us to think beyond, to use an old-fashioned term, beyond immanence as opposed to transcendence, immanence versus transcendence, but rather to think of immanence alongside transcendence, which is more of a LARUELLian. Well, then putting that back, and it's also, you mentioned Wittgenstein, it reminds me of the Wittgenstein thing that everything is just left the same. It's just we see it differently, the figure of ground kind of, we just see it differently. We see transcendence as immanence, and they become indiscernible, so to speak. But then going back to materialism, and it's, you know, immanence, transcendence, okay, abstract enough. We can think about those things as something we could confuse on purpose. What about matter and spirit, materialism or idealism, or materialism and spiritualism? Like, we're still holding on to that language of matter, just as, and maybe Rocco will respond as well, in the end, he still uses the word immanence, and he's trying to go beyond immanence and transcendence, but in the end, he opts for a word, and he knows he knows from his Derridean background that the language you choose, the terms, is very important. It's not just in the margins that, oh, it's just a matter of convenience. Bergson famously, of course, says, well, I'm going to pick a term. I'm against the dualism of matter and idealism and the thing and the representation. So I'm going to pick the neutral term image in between, which of course just creates more headaches for everyone. Why is image a neutral term? And it seems to be very, biased already. So why, for a philosopher or non-philosopher with his, as I said at the end of my opening, that he was such a sophistication about positionality, about the logic of opposition that is part and parcel of philosophy's modus operandi, the way philosophy works in oppositional, a kind of dialectics, small d. And why opt for a language, a vocabulary that is so one-sided? And this is Derrida asks, the area where he's been asked this question before. Why do you use such traditional philosophical terms? And of course, his answer is, well, I'm not using them. I'm using them, but I'm using them in a non-standard way. But nonetheless, he still chooses certain terms. Why does he choose the word matter? Is it a cultural, historical moment? Is it strategic? And then maybe Rocco as well, if you'd like to answer why immanence?
Yeah, good question. I always have had an issue with immanence, as if it was a self-defeating proposal, because immanence implies truth or thought and the real on the same side in a way. Maybe we are reading the term in a Deleuzian fashion only, and that's why we see it that way, and we see a problem, and we see the problem of the dyad matter idea or spirit implied there by the very use of the term immanence, if I understand your comment correctly.
Yes, not just immanence.
And I agree with it, and I see a problem there, and I've always seen a problem there. I mean, I've used the term immanence in the way he does, in order to, LARUELLE does, in order to be terminologically precise. But I have felt a certain unease with the term precisely because of this question. Even before I became a materialist.
But why matter, though? I'm saying, well, isn't there a similar problem with the word matter?
Isn't a similar there a similar problem with the term matter? In a way there is, as I said, that I tried to abide to, Marx's dictum: avoid matter, avoid materialism, insist on real, physical, physical, sometimes even nature, which complicates things. Simply not to fall into the trap of philosophy, which ends up being always inevitably some form of idealism. But in the absence of a better term, we must non-standardize the term and use it because there is no other choice, as Ray says in his PhD. If we want to have, as philosophers, and as Anthony said at the beginning, if we want to have a conversation with the sciences in a democratic fashion, without our, esoteric language and topic fixation on topics, themes, etc., we must admit that the only we must admit, we don't have to, according to me, and obviously according to young Ray, we have to embrace that the shared episteme is the materialist, because treating reality in such a way is the only thing that can connect us with the sciences. Because you see, even when the sciences when the scientists declare themselves to be Platonists, like they take Penrose, or I don't know who else made that choice, or even some evolutionary biologist would, just say, I guess I'm an idealist or a Platonist or whatever. Still, the way they handle the matter now in the sense of material, it's still a treatment of the treatment of the matter at hand is still as if it was a material or physical reality, but without the physicalism. Even materialist, with everything that it implies, an object that is subject to a certain consideration, etc., etc. The practice of rational thought, as we have known it since Aristotle. I don't know.
Well,
yeah. I guess if Rocco has something to add.
Just to add to that, I mean, it seems to me that's one answer to the question would be, if I hear you right, something like a modus vivendi strategic approach, that matter is something that allows philosophy and the entire transcendental apparatus to engage, say, with the sciences. And in a way, I think that this is what happens in LARUELLE's most recent work, right? With the engagement with quantum mechanics and in tetralogos, it's very explicitly saying, no longer can we take science just as the form of science, but we have to take actual science as it is given to us, right? And in particular, the best physical science we have, quantum mechanics, and then use that in relation to kind of transcendental philosophy. But I think that there's also a solution more from the side of the subject and from the side of the human. And maybe this goes back to someone like Schopenhauer, who is willing to kind of take the plunge and say, after Kant, okay, how do we know the Ding on Sich? We are the Ding on Sich, right? How do we know the will? That's just what we are. And LARUELLE answers in some of his early work this question quite explicitly. I think when he's questioned by Derrida at one point, how are you given this one? Essentially, his answer is just, I presume that that I possess it, right? And I think that in order for non-philosophy even to get off the ground with all of its complex apparatus of method and so forth, we have to presume that we know what we want. We don't have to presume that we have articulated clearly what it is that we want, but at a kind of Gnostic level, we know that what we want is what we want, right? And that I think, even at that starting point, non-philosophy is doing something very different from philosophy. Philosophy and philosophers do not like to admit that they begin from something like desire, even when they talk about desire, and they talk incessantly about desire, right? They almost always want something like an absolute derivation of the structure of desire or text or revolution, right? But I think non-philosophy, because it is radical and not absolute, at some level is willing to accept that right from the start, if we're working, say, in the sphere of political revolution, rather than derive the necessary structure of revolution, right, or the necessary alignment of thought with leftism rather than rightism, or what have you, right, we have to accept that this is just who we are and what we want. Given that what we want is immanence, it then becomes possible to choose the term immanence as the best term occasionally, that through its semantic logic enables us, through dualysis, to use its semantic syntactically to overcome its opposition to transcendence. So the strategic element kicks in, but it only kicks in because we already have presumed we know what we want. And that's I think one of the extraordinary things about Laruelle. I think he's one of the very few truly honest thinkers, in that he really is willing to accept trade-offs and not paper them over. And I think one of the trade-offs that's right at the core of his method is to refuse to pretend to be absolute, right? And at some level that means he remains radically finitized, right? Anything that happens in non-philosophy cannot be grounded in anything other than a kind of a priori decision, which is the decision I always already am, rather than the decision that I make.
So I think he's the only one who's consciously biased, as opposed to just being biased, I suppose is a colloquial way of putting it. Jonathan, do you want to add anything or take us on a turn?
I suppose I'd just add one thing to this is that I would, and this might go in a different direction, but I find the question of decision in Laruelle interesting and sometimes vexed, because on the one hand, as many of us know, this insistence upon identifying philosophy with this invariant structure, this decision on the real, does, I think, encounter certain questions when we also put that side by side with what Rocco says about, there is, of course, I mean, in a sense, like Laruelle is a fundamentally decisionist thinker. I mean, that there is a kind of groundless immanence to decide on the one. And I mean, so there is, I think this, to me, that's a kind of interesting tension.
Well, of course, yes. And that tension can be used, of course, to as a critique of that Laruelle is just another philosopher. He is taking just one more position rather than a decision, rather than going beyond in whatever way that was. And it's interesting in as much as when you have a radicality or he doesn't like the word absolute, but that's it. Badiou uses the notion of absolute immanence. When you have this kind of notion of radical immanence, and it becomes this kind of arcade term, that is, you could argue, the more prevalent it becomes, the less useful it is, in the sense, vacuous. Badiou would be happy with it being vacuous, of course, because everything is built on the void. But if it's everything, then it is in a sense nothing. Interestingly, again, another parallel with Bergson, that Bergson's famous for the élan vital that moves everything around. Canguilhem wrote an interesting critique of creative evolution, saying that everything could be said, you could just flip Bergson's entire argument and call it the élan material, not the élan vital, the élan material. Everything would work the exact same. It would just be a mirror system. And I just can't help thinking, given what we know of Laruelle's anti-dialectical approach, I don't know if there's a unique syntax to immanence such that you couldn't do everything with the word transcendence, the philosophical use of the word transcendence, and then materialize it, in a sense, non-standardize it, and get the same result, in a sense, because it's being used as a piece of matter, raw material, in a sense, a pawn, but so not taken seriously in the game of philosophical positions, but as just one pawn along with immanence. Now, his immanence is something beyond it again. But again, that brings me up the question, well, why use that word? Why use the word material or matter? Even?
And just one thing that comes to mind, John, while you're speaking about this, and I think it returns to this, certainly a preoccupation of mine, which is thinking about trying to take seriously, or as a point of departure, let's say, the materiality of philosophical work. Right? Not work on materialism, but what is the materiality of philosophical explication or postulation or what have you? And I think there is a kind of I mean, I guess there's, and this is also something I've learned from Rocco's work, Katerina, your work, John, is like, you know, and you mentioned at the beginning, I mean, non-philosophy, as I understand it, is a doing. It is a practice. And so, and in that sense too, I think there's interesting convergence with Wittgenstein. But at least the early one is look, the process that what I'm doing here in the Tractatus is trying to carry out a procedure to get us out of the fly trap or whatever, you know, out of the fly bottle, right? So it's a practice, it's a doing, it's not about, and that there is something, I guess, there's a kind of, I don't know, I say immanent pragmatism to it. I'll cabin that for a moment. But the other thing I want to come back to is also, I think one thing that's been out of this conversation, but maybe implicit in it, is that for me at least, certainly speaking as somebody who's interested in the history of art, among other things, is that I never understand materialism to be a standalone thing. I always understand it to be historical. I mean, you know, just so that if what he's doing is a kind of is rethinking the practice of philosophy as a materialist practice, not a materialist philosophy, but a materialist practice, then when it comes to using terms, I would suppose, like immanence or transcendence, one should then think about not only are these standalone sort of material terms that I can inscribe on a piece of paper, but they are freighted with history and the materiality of that history that, you know, just in very plain terms is embodied in things like books and traditions of teaching and so forth. So I don't know where to go with that exactly, but I feel like the sensitivity towards the historical question in all things material, at least for me, that's also important. We never simply, and I guess that's why we never simply write in that void. We write within, I think, an historicity of material practice. But.
Great, thank you very much. I'm conscious of time beating down on us. We have about half an hour, I think, to go, unless I'm corrected. And some questions have been amassing and are relevant. I'm not exactly sure. We've got questions from the floor. We've got some written questions in the whole chat window within Zoom. And we have questions which are being curated, so to speak, from the YouTube stream. But one that I'm going to start with, because it was a kind of a participant, Jeremy Smith, who has now left. He had to go and teach, he says, but he had his hand up earlier on. So if it's okay, unless anybody says not to do it, I'm going to read this one out, and he's got a couple of questions, but I'll stick with the first one because it's to the point for you, Rocco. And it refers, well, I don't know if you can see it now, if you scroll, but anyway, I'll read it out if you haven't. It says, Rocco, you mentioned machinic materialism, something I wanted to discuss if I had the time. I was wondering if you could please elaborate on that particular framework, inclusive of political materialism as introduced in Nietzsche contra Heidegger and Au-delà du pouvoir. How does the Nietzschean period of LARUELLE's thought differentiate itself from non-philosophy proper, or is it one continuity throughout? He has some other question, but let's stick. Oh, he's got three. Well, you're only allowed one. That's the rule, unless we have to go back. So, Rocco, the Nietzschean period of LARUELLE, is this the key? Is this the secret that we all need to know? That this it is, you know, the elaboration of a logic that's to be found in those early works.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, I think it really, it's a very rich question for thinking about LARUELLE, and it goes back to this problem of, you know, how can immanence be the immanence of both immanence and transcendence? How can non-philosophy establish the continuity between itself and the thing that it generalizes, right? If philosophy one is, at least according to LARUELLE's own account, philosophy and not yet non-philosophy, right? In that sense, non-philosophy breaks with philosophy, and yet the whole notion of non-philosophy is that the non is not a negation, not a break, not a new overcoming. And that's, you know, I think it's more helpful to think of the, you know, what LARUELLE has come to call the phases of non-philosophy, right, rather than the stages or the periods. That even philosophy one is a phase of non-philosophy. It just hasn't yet, it hasn't brought to light the specific techniques of thought according to the one, right, which allow LARUELLE at a theoretical level to solve certain problems. So at the level of content, the problems are perfectly well posed just in his early reading of Nietzsche, and his very interesting sort of oscillation back and forth between a Nietzschean and a Heideggerian position. It's really quite beautiful in Nietzsche contra Heidegger. The kind of impetus of the book as a whole is to say, you know, we can have a Nietzschean, a kind of Deleuzian Nietzschean reading through the aphorism that allows us to get beyond the kind of finitude of hermeneutics that we you know, that is kind of this reactive remainder in Heidegger. But then by the time we get to beyond the power principle, it's the positions have basically been reversed, so that LARUELLE is essentially advocating a kind of Heideggerian position, especially a sort of late Heideggerian, you know, Gelassenheit against a sort of Nietzschean affirmative metaphysics. But if the solution isn't there, and instead there's a kind of oscillation or shuttling, right? The problem is well posed, which is, between Nietzsche and Heidegger, what the hell are we supposed to do, right? Where the hell do we stand, right? The problem is well posed, and it's well posed as a problem that is both a problem of interpretation or hermeneutics and a problem of the beyond interpretation or beyond hermeneutics, which would be something like a Nietzschean will to power, right? Can we ever make sense of the relationship between will to power and interpretation, right? Probably not, unless we go to a level where we have a new theoretical apparatus that allows us to engage that particular problem no longer while being inside of it, right? And this is, that's why I think the movement to the notion of a scientific use of model rather than a philosophical conception of knowledge through epistemology is so central to LARUELLE, right? If we try to know the real, right? And of course, if we're talking about Dasein or we're talking about will to power, we presume that we're inside the real. I can't talk about will to power without exhibiting will to power. I can't talk about Dasein without being Dasein, right? But a theoretical model presumes that the problem of reality is unsolvable, pushes reality away and says, I'm only going to use that as the contribution of measurement data once I get to the level of experiment, and instead I'm going to construct something completely artificial called a model, make sure that it is internally consistent, right? But know in advance that it is not the real, it is rather my construction. Once I've created that model, the theoretical model, then I can test it against data, but I'm not claiming that the model is real. I'm just working then with the model in a self-conscious way, right? And that seems to be a different approach to, say, the Nietzschean Heideggerian problematic. So in that sense, it's there both is and is not a theoretical break, right?
Okay, good. Okay. I've got two questions that I'd like to allow through. One written and another from, so Dimitro Mazur, you've got your hands up if you're still here. I'll get to that. But, somebody else who's been waiting in the wings, Alfonso Williams. And it's an interesting question. I think maybe Jonathan to start it, then Katerina perhaps. Given Jonathan mentioning of the kind of aesthetics and art practice as a kind of sort of a practice of non-philosophy outside of philosophy without any before avant la lettre, so to speak. But here's the question, it's interestingly posed. If Laruelle himself or Laruelle representative was an independent contractor hired by a team of physicians, engineers, politicians, or whatever else to engage a specific practical problem, maybe an aesthetic problem as well, a bunch of artists in a room, what would Laruelle's role be at this meeting? So maybe Jonathan and Katerina, what would Laruelle contribute?
I'll take a stab at this, and it really is just a stab, but I hope this will get to the end, some kind of answer. One thing I take from Laruelle to be, one of the things I take to be quite interesting is that given, as we know, his broad and some would say contentious or contestable definition of philosophy as this invariant gesture or structure or decision on the real, what I find the payoff about that way is that it, on the one hand, it puts real demands on academic philosophy, let's say broadly construed, that I think are new and interesting, but it also allows us to, in a strange way, or not a strange way, in a serious way, take forms of speech or forms of practice that wouldn't themselves identify as philosophy and actually hold them accountable. You know, going to, I don't know, administrative meetings at a university or something. And well, let's just all be very practical here and we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And when you see decisions being made in a context like that, in the name of being practical, there's a way of kind of Laruellian reading that says, well, this is actually kind of a philosophical decision. And you should be responsible to that decision and to the implications of it, the presuppositions. So I feel like if Laruelle's at a meeting, the role that he plays is perhaps the one I could see him playing is to maybe show us in those contexts where we think it's all just practical matters, that there actually might be unstated, implicit, philosophical presuppositions that are not being thought of as such, or that the speakers are not taking responsibility for actually having a position with respect to reality or politics or what have you, because they're just sort of masking it, perhaps unknowingly masking it in terms of, oh, we're not, you know, here to philosophize, we're just here to get down to business or whatever that is. I feel like that's one of the roles he can play, is to actually show us where sometimes we're at our most philosophical or theoretical, precisely when what is being talked about is practical matters.
Super, great. Katerina, do you want to have a go?
Well, to me, Laruelle actually always allowed for devising a certain model, an approach to a question, and the way Rocco spoke about in treating matters of reality, which can be of this nature, like politicians, physicians, or whatever. So it allows for creating a model that is not entrapped in, that is open. So opens up for a conversation with all these other disciplines or other types of practices in a way that a standard philosophy wouldn't. It would remain enclosed in its own universe, and, you know, this membrane of what is philosophy and how philosophy speaks to, you know, the rest of the reality, or the other forms of thought and language would remain like that. It would seclude, or it would preclude an opening up of a conversation. I think that it does allow for this democracy of thought, of this democracy of different disciplines conversing on equal footing and jointly creating a level of conversation, a level of interaction that could create something epistemically novel, which would be easily, should be easily translatable into a new form of practice. So in a way, I'm building on what just Jonathan explained. So it's more or less, the same.
Yes, you're making the similar point almost from different angles, in as much as there is a philosophy immanent within engineering practice, political practice even. And of course, that can be pernicious. It can be, in a sense, and let's say an artistic practice, a practice of photography even. A photographer can theorize about itself and say, oh yes, my work is very close to whatever Merleau-Ponty. And in a sense, LARUELLE is saying, you don't have to go there. Don't use it as a crutch. There is already a novel, more interesting philosophy, perhaps, in the practice of photography. It doesn't need to look to Merleau-Ponty. So in the sense, if those practitioners in the room are all turn to LARUELLE, says, okay, give us the philosophy, you're the master, you're the authority, give us the philosophy of what we're doing. He'll say, hell no, it's already here. It's already there in your work. Maybe it's pernicious or whatever, or maybe not, but certainly there is original thinking. There can be, it's not always, of course, but there can be original philosophy, democratized, as Katerina says it, at work in the room, so to speak. You don't need me to point it out. So it says, what is he doing there? In a sense, he's kind of a sort of witness, perhaps, a corrective in case somebody says, oh, I'm glad a philosopher is here to, he's there to kind of negate his own presence in a way. But I'm conscious of, we have Dimitri Mazur was a question who's took their hand down, but I don't know, do they?
Yeah.
You can hear, you're going to come in now, and let's have that question, Dimitri.
Okay, I have, thank you all for this beautiful conversation. Yeah, and I have a question, intuition, I don't know how to call it. You were talking about materiality of thought, yeah, materiality of philosophy and so on. And I found it very close what Spinoza is talking about it, yeah, in a way that he's not reduce thought to extension, but applies to the thought the same principle of understanding that he applies to extension, yeah. And for example, Zrubashvili calls it a physics of thought. And if this question is stupid, I hope you will forgive me. But if we can see the same principle in LARUELLE, and if we can, maybe we also can find a historical influence of Spinoza on LARUELLE through Deleuzian or Althusserian legacy. Thank you.
Right, who would like to go first there? Spinoza, Althusser, obviously, you've got the determination in the last instance. Katerina, do you want to with the Althusser angle? Or?
Well, I've written on the links between Spinoza and LARUELLE and the revolution. The couple of chapters there. So yeah, I agree that I don't know how I would treat the comparison now, but I've written on that, and I agree with you, Dimitri, that there is some link there. There is some similarity, but we must not forget that Spinoza is still a philosopher after all. That is the key difference between him and LARUELLE. So this comparison would not be absolute, I would say.
Okay,
if I could add to that quickly, this was sort of Deleuze's reading of LARUELLE's project. That in just a very kind of schematic way, it's in a footnote to what is philosophy. writes something like LARUELLE's approach is, one of the most interesting undertakings in contemporary philosophy. It seems to, the LARUELLian one seems to be very similar in spirit to the Spinozist one. And then LARUELLE writes this elaborate kind of almost violent response saying, no, this is completely wrong. I'm not a Spinozist. I think it's this question of discernibility, right? Every monism is in principle indiscernible from every other monism, right? There can't be a bunch of different ones. So every one has to be the genuine one, right? But of course the articulation is specific in each case. How can we rescue Spinoza on LARUELLian terrain? I think it would be a little bit like Kierkegaard's response to Hegel. Kierkegaard says at one point, this Hegelian system is very beautiful. It's wonderful. If only at the end of it, Hegel had said, yeah, and the whole thing was just a joke, right? Then Hegel would have been complete, right? What is the Hegelian fault from a Kierkegaardian point of view? It's not writing the system, it's believing in the system. And I think that there's a similar problem at the heart of Spinozism, which is that Spinoza writes the ethics, right? The internal consistency of the ethics, the internal consistency of a radical monism can't be, it's not that it isn't in question, it can't be in question. There's no possible lever from which one can question radical monism, right? But Spinoza writes this book, right? And so on LARUELLE's terms, the only way that the ethics can be a non-philosophical book is if Spinoza writes it and then disavows that it has philosophical value, right? This is a model, this is an articulation of monism, but it's not telling us what is true, right? Because as soon as we claim that the theory of monism is true, then we've reintroduced transcendence, right? We've stepped into a game that LARUELLE wants to refuse to play. But then, the difference between that text disavowed and that text avowed is a kind of indiscernible difference, right? Because we don't add anything to the text by asserting that we assert that it is true, right? And so in that sense, that's where we can always recover philosophies on LARUELLE's own terrain. We don't have to oppose the non-philosophical view. The philosophy remains what it is. It just is embedded in, as Katerina was, a radical democracy, right? Spinoza is Spinoza. It's just that Spinoza is no longer opposed to Hegel or to Descartes.
I would just add only to that on Althusser that Althusser, as many know, has that statement in the introduction of Reading Capital, where he cites, in his view, his understanding of Spinoza and the important distinction between the real object and the object of knowledge. And I think that speaks to what Rocco was saying about, but that, even in Althusser, though he recognized the difference between the model, the theoretical model, and the, say between Marxist capital and capitalism, nonetheless, he isn't, I think Rocco put it well, he's not willing to, for political reasons, he's not willing to perhaps go that route and say it's only a model. It has to somehow be more real than that, than a model, the model form would allow.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and it'll be a good one because it's a question from Mark Devley, but it's been seconded by, I think, Martin McLaughlin here. And so here's the question. I wonder what your take would be on LARUELLE's later writing, Non-Standard Philosophy and the Tetralogos, when he seems to shed the domain of transcendental brackets logics, which seems to pervade the syntax of dualices we inherit if we discovered LARUELLE through his philosophy 2, 3, or even 4. Do you have a specific idea of what is happening there in this later work, 5 onwards, let's say, where he seems to be inventing new possibilities for invention rather than refining the ones he invented under the axiomatic intuitions of the one, radical immanence, unilateral dualities, subject, stranger, clone, etc. Okay, so the kind of question is, I suppose, in the sense, is there something of a, not a break perhaps, but something more like a rupture of some sort in Non-Philosophy 5, this later work, 2008 onwards, that seems to have a newer vocabulary and distance itself from cloning its older stratagems. Who would like to go first on that?
Well, I'll start, but I'll also open or continue a conversation we had years ago with Rocco on this, precisely this question. It was at Series E, and I kept protesting, like, what's this break? What's this, non-standard philosophy? What, why the need of, the notions of superposition and quantum physics, etc.? Isn't it all of that, all these terms, all this concept, aren't all of them already present in the older his older works? And isn't this just a metaphor, just yet another metaphor for whatever is already there since the beginning, and in his philosophy, in his, let's say, his non-philosophical stage, which has been most of his work since the very beginning of it. So I'm still not sure about that. The way I treat the newly introduced terminology, the newly introduced concepts, is still in a way a translation into the old ones, and kind of sometimes conflating the latter ones, the more recent ones, with the older ones. So to me, there isn't a real epistemological break there, but I may be wrong. I may have some blind spot there. I admit that, and I remember that at Series Z, Rocco tried to convince me otherwise. So
Rocco, right, over to Rocco quickly now, and then Jonathan, because we have earlier heard that it's all in Nietzsche, really. But now none of it's in Nietzsche, because it all began in 2008, perhaps.
Yeah, and that's, it seems to me, you don't have to go to non-standard philosophy and tetralogos to pose this question. And I think Jonathan can speak to this much more adequately. The works on photography already make this move, right? It's that, given, if LARUELLE's project is something like an imminent deconstruction of philosophy, right, then he doesn't need to go into external domains, right? He can work within the materiality of concepts, right? It's not a deconstruction, right? It's not a critique. It's something different, and that's why, I think that the work on photography is absolutely central. It's not a kind of funny deviation because he happens to be interested in a couple of photographic artists, like, oh, I'm just going to turn there. The whole point of this approach is that it enables new ways of grafting philosophy into non-philosophical domains and the reverse, in a way that doesn't presume that philosophy has the upper hand all the way through. And so the fact that he's done it with photography, right, is just one instance of this, or one model. But then he's, in a way, it's a virtuosic performance where he's saying, look, I can do the same thing with quantum science. I can do the same thing with a kind of religious Platonic mysticism in tetralogos linked to opera and music, right? This kind of like becoming symphony of the soul through almost like, some sort of cosmic becoming of the passage of the soul from the cave to the stars, right? It's a kind of mystical poem, right? It doesn't mean he's gone away from his project. He's just saying, look, you can do this too, right? There's nothing that excludes the implementation of non-philosophical methods in any domain whatsoever. And I think, yeah, Jonathan may be speaking specifically in the case of photography, because I think photography is a clearer case, maybe less muddled than the cases of quantum physics.
Okay, Jonathan, over to you.
Just 2 quick points, and we're short on time. So I would just say, and this will have to be left maybe just hanging, I do find the language of quantum physics, quantum mechanics in LARUELLE uncomfortable. And I don't know, I maybe just have a hang up because I tend to see it. I don't think he necessarily deploys it this way, but I see it as part of a culture of a kind of crass like spiritualism that mixes quantum. It just kind of leaves me a little bad flavor in my mouth. It reminds me of bad YouTube videos or something. But okay, but there's that. But the caveat I would add to this is that, and I have that feeling sometimes when reading like Baudrillard statements on cosmology or something, or use it like a metaphor. I mean, I'm not, but the one caveat I'll add to it, and I think this is to Rocco's point, and we haven't talked about this term, but there's that fractality in LARUELLE. And I see the fractal form as really useful in thinking about LARUELLE's projects, that there are differences between philosophy 1, 2, 3, etc. But I think it's useful to kind of think of it as a fractal, that he's kind of re-exploring at different levels, similar structures or same structures. And yeah, I think insofar as he doesn't impute any like realness to like, I'm making statements about, that quantum physics is the philosophy of our time or something. It's a model, like Rocco said, in which you can just say, I'm just using this as a model. I can model with photography. I can model with the terms of quantum physics or with opera. I guess I would say, yeah, I kind of see it from Rocco's vantage that I see these as different modeling languages. But I wouldn't impute anything necessarily more to it than that. Yeah, you can go in through photography, quantum physics.
I'd like to think that. I think from all the things I've heard him say, the quantum does loom large, certainly around 2008 to 2013, 14. So even when he's talking about a Christology, it'll be the quantum Christ, so the quantum returns in various ways. But and I try to, I myself tend towards a philosophy, non-philosophy 3, which emphasizes the most the democracy and equality of thought, and philosophy and non-philosophical practices. But let us bring this to an end. It's been very enjoyable, and I hope it's been valuable for everybody here. I thank the participants, including myself. I thank Katerina for really putting it all together. I had little to do with it. And all the team at SMR. I think officially, Katerina, we've really run out of time at this stage. Sorry if we didn't get to any questions. I don't know. But maybe email later on. I didn't see a new question coming up at the end. Shall we leave it at that, Katerina?
Yeah, I think that, we are way past our time. So yeah, okay. And yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I'll just see all the little windows die away into.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah, and thanks, John, for sharing.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.